Nestor, a natural question that sooner or later everyone asks themselves or others ask one as an artist. How did you become an artist? How does one enter this profession? How does one enter this career or investigation? So I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts about where you imagine you took to the idea of becoming an artist.
Well, I've answered that question a couple of times, and there wasn't really a defining moment. Mm-hmm. I think I'm trying to find a simile for this, or an analogy to describe the process, and I think I was more or less caught, or allowed myself to get caught in a kind of current, and then over time it became normalized, felt more comfortable, and I became interested in aspects about it. But I think if I were to isolate a particular moment in time, it would have been in high school, and I was starting to, I was doing a lot of drawing. My father, a number of years ago, gave me painting instructions, and I didn't do so well with the instructor. I don't think he was very happy with what I was doing, because it wasn't, I wasn't accurately representing the things he wanted me to represent. So, but I was still very interested in it, and that might have been the beginning. But then in school, I started to, there was a student who was much older than me. He was in grade 12 and I was in grade 9. And I started to do his homework for him. He was in an art class, and I started to make work for him. And this was my first paying job as an artist, and it happened rather, unexpectedly. And then, so when my art teacher had said that I should consider going to art school, I think with this, I think this helped me kind of. This was kind of a moment where I thought that maybe I could do this, and so so I started at OCAD. I entered into OCAD in the fine arts department, but I think the program, or the structure of the program, allowed me to do a lot of my classes in experimental arts. Mm-hmm. I had a bit more of a balance, so I was exposed to a type of art practice that was a little bit foreign to me, and I was kind of interested in it. But really the last year of my study was in New York, and that was my education compressed. And it was at that time I realized that this, that art is taken. It was the first time I encountered how seriously art is taken, and the kind of level of discourse, and the type of energy. This was in the late 80s, so there was kind of I think a kind of exciting period in New York. Mm-hmm. So that was my education compressed. I think it would have been, you have these forks in the road, and that was a fork in the road. If I hadn't gone to New York, I don't know if I would have really had the same kind of belief or conviction that this would, that this was a path to follow. So.
Was Tom Dean running it?
Yeah, Tom Dean was running it, and he had really organized an amazing program there. He had connections to a lot of interesting artists. We were doing studio visits every second week. There was the critiques, and we were having a kind of independent practice. But we were there was a similar program, an American version of this, and I always was struck by the differences between the students. We were, I'm not sure if we didn't take it seriously, but we didn't have the same kind of belief that this could be a paying job, as a career. I think we were just seeing where it goes. I think most of us felt, well, let's just see where it goes, we'll keep doing this and we'll see where it goes. But surprising the level of professionalism with the American students. I think they were already confident and hungry for a career in the arts, and I don't think that was the same for, if there is a kind of cultural distinction between these two, or which in the education programs, I think that was a big difference. And that was a bit of a shock to me as well, to see that real disparity in the level of professionalism.
Interesting.
Yeah.
At least in the relationship to the market.
Yeah, I think so. You know, I mean, the students had, you know, they had an open house, and we weren't really given instructions on what to do. We just set up our studios. We had an opening, and it was going to be a good party. But the American class had, it was very structured, very organized. A lot of the students had business cards, and a lot of them had, you know, very, I won't say talking points, but ways to kind of talk about their work very quickly and effectively. So we felt we were a little bit out of our depth there, but that was how I remember it. That was my experience with seeing seeing the other students. I was struck by that. But yeah, that was very important for me. I think spending time in New York.
Well, just thinking about you're talking about this difference that you just mentioned between the American and the Canadian students. Did you feel when you were faced with this that there was some form of answer to the question, what can an artist do or what does an artist do? Was their professionalism in a sense instructive as to what an artist does? In any case, I'm kind of interested what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I think so. I think we didn't really think seriously about the role of an artist in society. And maybe that was the distinction, that there was a sense of, how would you put it? Well, they were, how would I put it? A much stronger sense of the importance of the artist in society. I think maybe, you know, I don't know if it had the same kind of intensity with the Canadians, with my peers, you know. But partly this could be the way I was perceiving. I mean, this is, I think a lot has to do with my own personality, that I've always had a certain distrust, or not distrust, but a kind of uncertainty about the role of the artist in society. I'm still, because my entry into it was something that wasn't, it was more gradual. I never was quite sure whether this was, you know, going to be something I want to do for the rest of my life. I just said, well, I don't have any other better options, you know, and I kind of like a lot of these things. There are things I know now, and when I think in retrospect, I know that I am certain that I like working with materials. I like making things. It gives me a certain pleasure. I can say that, you know, with certainty now. There's just things now I know I can say with certainty that I wasn't sure then. Yeah, I think that, you know, I was, I think, I mean, after New York, there was a group of us that formed a collective, and it was at that point, there were a lot of collectives in Toronto. I think there was a shortage of exhibition venues. There was a shortage of exhibition venues, but a surplus of empty warehouse space. And that, I think, allowed for a lot of kind of collective projects and organizations to appear. And that was also very important, I think, in keeping this going. You know, I could have, after graduation, I think is a problem for a lot of students. If they don't keep going, they start to lose a certain belief in it or commitment to it, and then you know, when I think it, you know, begins to then you're less kind of committed to it. But after I set up a paint, because we set up a collective. I was part of a large Toronto exhibition called Diverse City, and again we were kind of just slowly beginning to figure out what, you know, how to kind of establish a kind of consistent kind of working practice. So, but the collective was helpful. We created a similar structure where we would meet for to talk about our work. We mounted, I think about 5 exhibitions over about 5-6 years. So that was very important as well. And I think after that, then I was, upset. I wasn't entertaining ideas about, other ways to make a living. I was going to do it.
I'm struck by something that I noticed in a comment on a exhibition that you had at Goodwater some years ago called Jesus.
Oh.
And the comment is, a great deal of Kruger's Jesus has to do, in fact, with decisions about not doing something.
Oh.
I think that...
Is that a review?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think perhaps it was John Goodman who suggested that one of the problematics, let's say, that you started with respect to that exhibition included the anxiety that you didn't want to do too much, like participating in the art experience or the gallery experience or in the transactions of the political economy of the art world. And yet you do talk about those things. So there's an odd paradoxical relationship that you appeared to have, at least in that exhibition. And I think I'm hearing a little bit in the approach that you have taken to art, not as a market economy, but as perhaps as a, what can we call it, some kind of investigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not, if John, I mean, it sounds like something John would say. John, that term is something that, the name of the show, is something that John, it was a kind of response to a lot of things, Jesus, if there was something, that surprised him, that would be the response. If there was something that disappointed him, it would be said slightly differently. The pitch would drop a little bit, It just, you use this word, I kind of like that, how this word could be used, just the way it was said from, or the way it was heard or experienced, could mean a lot of different things. It was a really versatile kind of expression. So that was a strange show. I had, and actually John was very important for me. I have to say, John and Roger set up a very unique project, and I literally stumbled into this as well. This is, I think, becoming a motif in my life, the way I get kind of caught in certain eddies that I allow myself to be caught into. And I mean, there are benefits to that, because I don't come with a lot of kind of preconceived ideas. I don't have a lot of enormous expectations, but then you get sort of used to it, and if you're not proactive, then when these things start to dry up, then you don't have really the tools to kind of start these things again. So, but John, that was very, I think working with John was very important for me, and I still value those interactions. He was unique because of how involved he was in the process. And I think not a lot of artists want that kind of level of involvement from, from a dealer. Some want a little bit more space, and which is, I understand. But with John, it always seemed like there was a kind of, I'm not quite a courtship, but that you had to build up a certain trust, and after that, then these conversations became really kind of exciting, because he took. The one thing I learned the most from John was that he took. I thought that, well, you think you have an idea and you're following it to its logical end, And then when you have a conversation with John, you go, oh, I'm not even halfway. This can keep going. And that was really exciting, I think, that I know now that even that has somehow been ingrained in my kind of working practice now. And it's something I even communicate to students, that I know that we only ever really reach a kind of certain point, and there's so much kind of more to kind of follow this through as an idea, a lot further. So there were a number of projects that emerged that way, that they have a kind of genesis, a kind of catalyst that gets them going, but then there's really, the outcome is so uncertain. And that project was, I don't think it was, I'm thinking about it now, there are things about it that I don't think were successful, but there are aspects of it that I've thought about and are helpful for me later on, maybe as a way of working. So, but your question was about not doing things, right? So I'm trying to think of why that was. I'm trying to think about that show in terms of how that was manifesting itself, and I can't. We were trying to. There were a lot of. I have to kind of start at the beginning, because there were a lot of. This was the kind of catalyst for the shows, where there were a lot of these holes in the gallery. There was a air return vent right in the middle of the gallery. There were other vents. There were windows. There was doors, and the project started about doing a sound piece in the basement, so that it could only be heard in the main gallery. But then we started to imagine, well, what would this person who's, it's that kind of persistent problem of urban living, where you're kind of forced into these situations where, your neighbor may be irritating you. So we thought, what does this neighbor do when the person below is, invading into the kind of private space? Well, they start plugging these holes with things, and that maybe that kind of narrative was kind of interesting enough to see, well, what would they plug the holes with? Well, whatever is convenient and available, and so we had a lot of plywood. So we started to kind of generate the forms, and then as that became a kind of motivation for the show, I started to finesse how the type of forms, and how and certain decisions, like, are they all the same size? Is there a relationship between all these forms together, which there was, and so that's how it kind of emerged. So I'm not sure how that connects to that statement, because it sounds a bit like a kind of philosophy, and I don't think that's something I've always I don't quite have a kind of manifesto yet for something like that. So.
But it does suggest your interest in social structures, which I do think, from what I've read, seems to flow through a lot of your work.
Yeah.
Would it be appropriate to think of that as a base or core idea that runs through the various works in your practice?
By social structures, do you mean, what do you mean by social structures? Well,
Contesting or observing the kinds of things that happen, such as the bad neighbor and...
Right, okay, well, I think so. I mean, if there is a kind of thread, maybe that's something, I was certainly, I mean, even when I reflect or think about work I did in over 10, 15 years ago, I think there might be, I couldn't articulate it, that's what was happening, but I think I think there was something about the relationship between the observer and the work, and I was trying to figure that out, or trying to kind of test it in certain ways. So I know that with some of these early wall paintings, they were generated by the point of view, the spectator's point of view, of isolating that point of view so that the work worked in a way, that it performed or had a kind of the function. So I know I did a number of paintings where that spot was so limited and narrow, and that I kept thinking, well, if it's so limited and narrow, what is the work outside of that? And then it becomes a kind of peripheral experience to the work, and it allows the work to be explored off axis, obliquely, and maybe that creates another type of experience where the meaning doesn't kind of, obscure other possibilities of seeing something. Because largely, if there's one thing I want to, I know that's been consistent, is just to see how setting up some of these things will generate a surprise or new forms in some way. So, but yeah, primarily, so then maybe I know that if that part of that relationship between the observer and the work, that is something that's been consistent. And I know, and we did that explicitly in one show at John's, where I can kind of really identify that as an important thread, which was the show called Monophonic, which is where we removed the front door and we created, because we kept talking about this interval or this transition between the public and the private space. When you enter a gallery, there's a kind of space, an area where you can, like a decompression chamber, where you can acclimate yourself to the space, and then you can kind of go in and where these two pressure levels equalize, and then you go into the space, and then you can look at the work. And we want to remove that area altogether, so that as soon as you touch the door, you were already engaged with the work. Before you had a chance to even begin to process what this was, you were already inside the work or engaged with it, or the encounter was very like an accident, So that was very specific, and so that, I think maybe that is the best answer to this, and probably the best evidence I can provide to this, my interest in what you call these social structures. So.
Social structures have had a long life in artistic practices, and I'm kind of curious whether the practices of other artists, or grandly speaking, art history, hold resonance for you.
Yeah, I look at a lot of artists for solutions. I've been thinking about, I've been trying to make work like, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but I thought, if I could just do something like Encore, if I could just find this practice, which is so, is in these date paintings where everything is kind of encapsulated in this world. There's the ritual of the painting, there's the kind of material handling, there's the reflection of the times, it's all kind of compressed, compacted into this form, and that level of efficiency and efficacy and crystallization and compactness has always been so seductive for me. And but I know that I can't just do a date painting, so I've been struggling to find another solution to that work. And so for him, he's always been kind of somebody I've always thought about, who has found something that has been able to sustain itself for and even not the paintings, even just by themselves, are not like the most seductive paintings. I don't go to his painting and say, this is and stand in front of it and go, this is amazing. It's this whole kind of practice that the paintings, the narrative around that production is just so seductive that I've been trying to figure out for myself as well. So I've been trying to explore. But there are other artists like Blinky Palermo is somebody I've looked at, because there's something so, it seems so effortless the way he can make these works, and these things and that's something I've always admired. Those wall paintings, I continue to think about. Some of the small shapes, the modesty of the forms is something I've always admired. And lately I've been looking at Deschamps again, and who else has been important? There's a French artist who was working in the States who works with text, whose name I've forgotten, but that's somebody I think about a lot as well, because I've been working with a lot of text lately and type, and the biggest struggle with it is just, for me was always coming up with the content, trying to, and he found a way to do it, so I look at his work a lot.
I do want to actually come back to another word of yours.
Oh, okay.
Thinking about what you were saying about Aunt Kawara and your ambitions, that you did it in 2008 at Art Metropole, a work called Oblivion.
Mm-hmm.
And although I didn't see that exhibition, when I read the description, it has that same sense of clarity, of precision that I heard you talking about in terms of Aunt Kawara.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that work now? And of course, just a short description of it.
Right, okay, so there were a couple of photographs that were halftone prints. I really finessed the dot. I made sure that the dot was a nice geometric circle, and because I really wanted that to be pronounced. And there are images of furniture. One's kind of like a men's and women's dresser. One's tall, 5 drawers, and one's wide, 6 drawers. And then there was a fish tank. I'm calling it a fish tank. We called it aquarium. I made it. That aquarium was because that show. If there is a catalyst, it was Art Metropole had this amazing vitrine, and I was so attracted to the volume, the proportions of that vitrine, and I wanted to reproduce it some way. And so we did all the measurements, but we ended up getting it wrong. I don't know how. We measured it twice. My friend measured it, who was helping me build the aquarium, the vitrine, and we were off by a significant amount. So it just never looked right. It was really unfortunate, because I would have liked to feel that resonance again between these two, this repetition, this echo between the two. Anyways, John and I would have these discussions about things like that, and I remember we had a conversation about that vitrine, because he remembers that vitrine. I think Edes actually was also attracted to the volume of that, or the proportion of that vitrine, had one also made. So this vitrine is already kind of generating certain forms. It had a particular resonance to it. So I wanted to reproduce that. But I created an aquarium so that I could create a kind of lens in the space, so it would affect how the other works with red, or kind of optically create some distortion. It didn't quite work. The space didn't really lend itself to that in the end. And then I was doing these small wall paintings of, they were grill patterns, grills like you would see on a speaker vent or speaker grill, or typically speaker grills, or something you speak into, these concentric circles. But there was something about there were ways of creating concentric circles that were kind of interesting to me. One was where the circles were evenly distributed, so there was something very static, very rhythmic about it. But there's also another way, which I was also experimenting with, which were these spirals. And then you have these kind of interlocking spirals on the concentric circles, which are produced by the way the dots are aligning themselves. And it was subtle, but I kind of liked looking at those. It's work I never it was one of these projects that kind of ended prematurely. I would have liked to have explored it a bit further, but I didn't in the end. But yeah, that show was probably, I wouldn't say it was precise. I was kind of feeling out a few different things to see how they would work. I was hoping it would generate something else. It's one of the I thought of it more of a transition show. I just wanted to see if I could, if there was a path that could be a bit more fruitful.
Hmm. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, we just talked about your relationship to other artists, and I'm just wondering if, obviously you look into these very clearly, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts that have been generated from that as to whether there is currently, now we're talking 2016, more or less, currently an evolving discourse or an evolving zeitgeist, I guess we could use the term, around which contemporary art circulates at the moment. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I do think, I don't know about artists from my generation, because I think maybe they're a bit more entrenched in certain ways of thinking about art. So I look for, you know, I mean, maybe from younger artists, especially from students, how they're beginning to think about the potential for this as a career or as a path. And I think if there is something, it is maybe that this, this growing awareness of the kind of ecological problems we're facing has some bearing on the decisions they're making, and so ethics, it seems to be an important way of thinking through this in terms of how to make work in a world where the kind of shrinking resources, and where because I think a lot of artists feel that, and I certainly feel it, that art is a kind of wasteful practice. It produces literally a lot of waste. I remember some of those wall paintings, and it was heartbreaking to see the amount of piles of garbage I would produce after work, and it's a struggle for me to go there, to think of that as a solution now. I would have difficulty making that work now, because I know that, you know, when you do a vinyl mask, you're going to just produce 3 times as much waste, and I can't go there. So I'm beginning to adjust my thinking about what I can do. I mean, I admire that period, sometimes that period in the 60s where there was it seemed to me a lot of kind of effort to figure out how to make work without making things, and you know, I don't think they entirely successful with that, but maybe maybe it's kind of similar thinking is appearing, that artists are saying, well, I can't keep making stuff. I mean, and there's also this. I mean, there are just certain realities that are affecting the way artists make work now, and that would be something I see an adjustment artists are doing, are making.
You mentioned the students, actually, and of course that is a good touchstone to what is an evolving context today. You've taught for quite a long time, and you're well known for that, as well as being an artist. Do you have any thoughts about the role that the teaching holds for you, and of course how you find your responses to the students?
Well, it's exhausting, as you know. But there's something actually what's the word? This, I mean, I kind of like working with the undergraduate students, especially even some of the earlier years, because the way they figure these things out. I'm just amazed how quickly they can get a project together. It takes me so long now; it's unbelievable. And they have these demands to make something, and they have to work very quickly, and not all the time the results are amazing. But I'll consistently always get something that surprises me, and I am amazed how they found it. What things. How they discovered this, and they may not even be aware that that this is something of value. But I'm just always amazed, and sometimes I keep that kind of excitement to myself because I know it'd be hard to draw that out in them. But that's rewarding. But I actually particularly like this kind of absurdity of teaching art in an academic environment. I know it's a constant struggle and I always have to find ways to rationalize and justify it, and even this elaborate process of evaluation, because I think most instructors will say that they don't like that process of evaluation. But I know it's hard, but I actually think it's very helpful, and I take it. I spend a lot of time evaluating the students' work because I have to really provide a compelling argument for them, and that's a type of skill that I think is helpful, and it helps me understand the work better, and a way to articulate what I'm seeing, what's of value, and to be able to articulate it to, I would say, a non-specialist, which is even more challenging, to hope that they can recognize. Because I think what we're teaching them is a type of avant-garde practice, I think, and I think that's difficult. Most students just accept it, but it's hard in this anything goes environment, to say to make these determinations between good and bad, and I find that incredibly useful. And Patton told me this amazing story. I hope I remembered it correctly. It doesn't matter. But he was doing some research on Amy Knoebel and Blinky, and Joseph Beuys would visit the room. Knoebel did this amazing work, which I've always liked, which is called Round 19. I think that's the room beside Beuys' room, because Beuys' class was packed. It was about adjacency. They may not be able to attend Beuys' class, but they would be close to it, and they would somehow be able to pick up something, and that I like that idea a lot. And then so Knoebel did this really great work, which is still changing and modular and always a kind of dynamic sculptural environment. But so at one point, Beuys, Knoebel and Blinky invited Beuys over to evaluate their work, and they made all these paintings, and they made this big pile of paintings, and Beuys silently kind of started putting paintings into two piles, and they were just watching him, and then Beuys at the end pointed to one and said good, pointed to the other and said bad, and then left, and they were just why why is this good? They're trying to find, and that I find that process very rewarding, and I think it's part of the so much a part of the instruction is this is figuring out why these things are good and bad, because I still unsure about them. You instinctively know it, but yeah.
Interesting, because it strikes me as you were talking about grading, that of course it offers a conundrum to the student, don't we know? They're always appealing them. But more importantly, perhaps in the long run, it offers an instruction to the instructor themselves about how they themselves view their own work in terms of what is good and bad, or the work of others. Because as you said, in a climate of pluralism, whether that's now or in the past, it's hard to make those distinctions. You can just say, well, it's all good.
Yeah.
But in fact, if you have an organized necessity to say this is good, that's bad, then you make choices, and choices are good.
Yeah, that's the question, right?
It's a comment, but it's also a question.
Yeah. Yeah, choices are good. I mean, I've always thought, sometimes I tell the students about, which I always think about, is that art, I mean, because the one way of evaluating work, which is a reliable method, is the evidence of labor attached to it. If they can see that there's, hard labor, and it, some the meter goes up, all of a sudden the work is in another realm. And but I want to kind of challenge that sometimes, and how effortless art appears sometimes. It just, and I sometimes give the example of a student who I know, and this is something that students are very heightened, have a heightened sense of justice. I think, they want to, when you're evaluating, they either resonate with their own, with their own beliefs about, what's good and what's bad in the work, or it challenges in some way, like it bristles, because why is this person good? You obviously didn't work enough on it. But I like this, because it was this classic case where it's first year class, and the students, it's maybe the first time of kind of formal instruction in art, or a very particular type of art instruction, because they're not getting it in high school. I'm quite certain, most high schools don't teach the type of art education that they would get at college or university level, type of history instruction. Maybe some schools, but not all of them. So they had a video project, and the student returned with their work. And I know that they did it last minute, and I know it was obvious, and I knew that she was trying to, that she was smart. She thought, I'm just an hour before I know this is, it's probably going to recognize, I'm probably going to get trashed, but so what, But it was really good. The video was excellent, and it all because. But I don't think she could recognize why it was good, but the sense of effortlessness in the production, nothing was overthought. There was something very kind of compelling about, because it was all about these interactions she was having with her friends. Basically, she just set up this camera in her room, and her friends were having a party, and they were just, having this exchange. But it was so good. And I think it was good because students at that level they're already quite savvy with certain technology, being so inundated with this medium that they already have an instinct for the medium. They're not overthinking. It's already internalized in a kind of interesting way. I could never do something like that, not with that same kind of ease and freedom. But I gave her a good mark in the students. I think some students were absolutely horrified by that, and that I was saying that this was good. But I challenged her. I said, try and make another one. See if you make 5 of those, that are just as good, And I suspect she wouldn't be able to, So sometimes it just appears out of the mouth. Anyways, that's how. I have to believe an art is kind of mysterious that way, that we can make that you can put so much effort into something. I know I know that now you put a lot of work into something, but it's not going to be art. In some cases, you could work your ass off on something, and it's just never going to be good. So you can't follow a set of a recipe, and you're going to get good stuff. I don't know.
Nestor, we've just been talking about teaching, and of course that leads to a question about theory, because theory is such a large part of academic instruction these days, and and to some extent, a large part of how artists themselves think through their practice. So I'm kind of curious to what extent theory plays a role in your thinking.
Well, in school I was terrible at it. I just could not understand it, and I made an effort, but there was a long period where I just wasn't reading anything, and then I got back into it. I started to read a lot about painting because I was still painting, and I really wanted to figure it out. I needed to find some way, that there must have been some way of articulating what these things, what these actions that we were doing, or the explorations we were in. It just didn't seem convincing to me that we were just doing them out of thin air. You know, we were just inventing them, that we were part of a kind of, I don't know, community. Or even if we weren't reading the same text, that we were part of something, and somebody was articulating what that was. So I started to read a bit more about it, and reading it, like looking for these answers. You know, what are the answers? I read a text a while ago, actually, because I really like. I know that in some of these questions talked about this important relationship between artists and writing, and I think that was something that maybe emerged a bit more vigorously in the 60s. And I mean, there were artists who were writing, you know, the turn of the century as well. But I think that connection, I like that moment a lot, because there were a lot of new things, especially like how this type of, you know, how the education got formalized, how artists started to write about it. There was just kind of these important moments during that. So that's a period I go back to a lot. And so I'm reading. Moira Davey wrote a book called, I think it's called On Reading, and she was talking about another essay by Virginia Woolf, which was called How to Read. And that has been helpful in explaining some things to me about the relationship that artists have to writing and theory. Is that Virginia Woolf was saying that, well, she kind of condenses it. She says, I'm just going to compress it. She says that when you're ready to write poetry, you're ready to read it. And I think that really was meaningful for me. A way of articulating our relationship to theory was that once you start making work, I think you start reading theory a lot differently, because you're starting to read it in a way that you really want to genuinely understand some of these processes and thinking. So I started to read it a little bit more like that, and then it began to resonate. And I wasn't reading it in a way where I thought I had to understand the text completely, or that I had to understand it, all at once. Not all at once, but I started to read it in a much different way. I could be okay with just understanding parts of it. I could be okay with just it being, reading only a part of it. So that got rid of a lot of anxiety with the approaching the text. So, but it took some time, and so now I read it. Now it provides some pleasure. A lot of the times, not all. Some texts I still find obscure, but I don't get freaked out by the obscurity anymore, or the kind of the language. I know that it's going to at some time it might resonate, and then you'll be able to hear it. So I finished I just finished reading The Life of Forms by Henri Faucillon, which I really enjoyed. So there were parts in that text that were just kind of synced up with things that I was thinking about, and was able to articulate, and gave me a certain kind of courage, to continue doing what I'm doing. So theory can do that, I think, for me. And if my students are, some students really like to read theory but they read it in a way where they're looking for explanations, and I don't think that's the right way. I mean, I don't stop them from reading it in that way, but I think there's another way to read it. So.
What about literature?
Yeah, I read a lot more literature when I was young. My father was, well, he was a prisoner of war in Latvia for 3 years. So, but he developed a real attachment to Russian culture. So I learned the language, and we were well stocked in our home on Russian literature. So I grew up on that writing, and I read a lot of Dostoevsky, Maxim Gorky,
In
Chekhov.
English, I see.
What's that?
In English, I see.
Yeah, in English. And my father was he was an important influence on me, and so I was reading it, a lot of it, just to simply understand, get a sense of who he was, why these were interesting for him. So it was always his Solzhenitsyn was very important for him, and Tolstoy. So these were texts that I was reading in a very particular way, to understand somebody I felt I didn't know very well.
Sure.
So, so for a number of years I was reading a lot of kind of classics. But then I started to read things to explain art. Or to kind of give me a better sense of how this kind of phenomenon. And then, but I have recently I've been reading a lot of the form of the short story, and because I've had some interest in also the form of the parable, so I've been reading a lot of work about the parable, and short stories which adopt this kind of form in a way. So Kafka is one writer I've read. I always come back to, and I read a collection of Russian folk tales, and I did read. There are some texts on theology, because the parable is an important form in the New Testament. So, and I'm just very curious about that. Very interested in that as a form. So.
What you were saying a few minutes ago actually is interesting, Nestor. You were talking about this question of piggybacking. As you know, obviously, since you teach, there has been a review, you might say, of the question of originality in contemporary theory. And a real question about what constitutes what we used to call authenticity. And so I'm kind of interested if you have any thoughts about this question of authenticity and how we can approach it today, because we have, you might say, critiqued it to such a degree.
Mm-hmm. I came across that question, and that's a challenging one. I wish I had a statement, a good articulate statement to respond to that, but I don't. I guess I don't really think about it so much. It's not a kind of, I don't attach so much value to that as important to the experience of the artwork. I think, there are, I don't know, I just think our encounters with the art object are so varied, that at one point, you see the same thing several times, and always seems a little bit different in some cases. So I never quite know if I'm having an authentic experience. I'm not. Yeah. So I have trouble, and it all. I guess I've placed less value because I know that the students place so much, an enormous amount of value on it, much to the detriment of their own production. It just handicaps a lot of them and paralyzes them because they just don't want to go near certain subjects or near certain or apply certain processes or methods to make work. And so I think in some cases it becomes more of a problem than something that could touch value to. Having said that, though, I know that I will use it as a kind of when I'm thinking about something or judging, and I might say, boy, that person is an authentic thinker, or that is, I've had a kind of experience of something that feels authentic in a way, and by that maybe maybe there's something special about it, something unique, but it's also located in a particular temporal moment maybe. So I just don't think the kind of the rigidity or the kind of stability of that. I'm also slightly unsure about it. No. Anyways, I know, but I've had this problem with this, with writing because I want to write, but I know I'm not a good writer. I admit that, and it's not hard to admit it. It took me a long time to say, it's okay, and but I don't. So, there was this one artist that I've always admired, just because I think she worked with appropriation a little bit differently, and it was Elaine Sturtevant, and she never called it copying, she called them repetitions, what she was doing. But what I think was unique about her was that she wasn't going to the canon, she was going to her peers and asking to do copies of their work. I think one of her first projects was to approach Andy Warhol and ask if she could borrow some of his flowers silk screens and start making Andy Warhol. So then Andy said, yeah, no problem, go for it. Elaine did one thing that she threw in always something that would identify it as her work. So she never quite the full way. There was always an error or some kind of identifying feature that would distinguish that work from something else, or from the work that she was repeating in some way. But I think that was another way to approach this idea of authenticity, and that this process of repetition is, I think, and it's another term that I kind of encountered recently. The idea of repetition is something that I think is something important, or as a concept, anyways.
Artists always find themselves the subject of criticism, and I'm kind of curious whether it's the criticism that one receives oneself about one's work, or criticism that you read that is written by others. I'm curious, in your experience, Nestor, if there's a particular kind of critical response that you have found useful in either of those cases over the years.
Do you mean through reviews, or yeah? Mm-hmm. Well, you remember the ones that are most painful, I think, and so it's a matter of figuring out how to reconcile that. And there have been a few that have stung, and I've thought about, and I've tried to kind of figure out a solution around it. And well, these solutions are productive. They can generate work, I think, and so it can be useful in that way. But it always, it's always, and they sometimes seem so innocuous, some of these things, but there's something about it that kind of stings. I remember I had a visit from a curator from the States, and I knew he was not impressed. You know, he was already had made up his mind, you know, about the work, but I only knew it 3/4 of the way through the talk, and I didn't make any adjustments to, you know, to how I was delivering the content, and I think I should have adjusted a little bit, you know, to respond to what I thought was a bit of resistance. But I didn't. But in the end, he just, it wasn't entirely dismissive, but he was just not convinced. But it was like a total, you know. Well, it was just what was surprised me was how total it was. You know, it wasn't that, you know, this one's good and this one, you know, well, whatever. You know, but it was just so total, and I just was surprised by that. And that was something I kind of think about. But I think. I've always, you know, I think sometimes the things you think about are from your peers, you know, conversations you have with your peers, because I do think that art is an important social practice, as you mentioned, and you mentioned social structure. I mean, I think that's very important, at least for me, that you're not making work for yourself, that you're making it for others. And so you always have somebody in mind that you're making the work for, either to make them happy, or to give them a kind of sense of pleasure, or to something, you know. It's something. It's a kind of the object becomes some kind of mechanism to connect with the other person, whether they know it or not. You know. So I know that that has always been influential, has some bearing on the way I make things, because that person or the image of the person orbits just above my head, and it's kind of guiding certain decisions. I'm thinking, is this the right decision? You know, would this make you happy? You know, and sometimes I allow it to happen, and other times you react against it or rebel against it. So, but it still guides, I think, certain decisions. And that is because there's a type of kind of critical discourse and relationship with those kind of memories.
I imagine you're thinking about specific critics or particular individuals who are committed to thinking about the work. And what about the general public?
The general public, I relish those opportunities, actually. I always want to be approached, you know, and genuinely ask, you know, what's going on here, because I think to be able to talk and articulate it in non-technical language is a really important challenge, and I like, because you really have to kind of focus on the essential components and elements and themes in the work, you know, and without the kind of support of history and theory and references, and I really welcome those opportunities.
I guess we talked around a number of the phenomena that we encounter as career artists, Nestor, and I'm wondering if, thinking about all that, what are your views on the art system as a whole, the whole network and context within which we operate?
I don't. I know. You know, you can get discouraged by it, but I don't know. I don't have any problems with that. I think there's a kind of outrageousness with it that you know, the more outrageous, the better to me. You know, the more I think it's just. I don't think we. You know, if we try to reason or rationalize what's going on, I think I don't. It's not. I don't find that interesting. But I don't. I'm not very. Admittedly, I'm not kind of part of it. I'm not connected. So I'm really an outsider. I mean, I feel like an outsider too. There's a whole other kind of realm, you know, that I'm, you know, not participating in. I've had some encounters with it earlier on when I was a bit younger. I had, you know, encounters with it, but I never felt kind of connected to it in that way. I always felt a bit outside of it. So I've always had a kind of more distant relationship to that market, which I know some people participate. It seems kind of manic to me, but I don't. I don't have much of a connection. I don't think a lot about it. Admittedly, I mean, I go to Contemporary Art Daily every once in a while, and I'm amazed that sometimes, there's some good discoveries there, but also there's this incredible uniformity to everything. I mean, that all the galleries have adopted the same format, I mean, almost universally, and it's remarkable. There's incredible homogeneity amongst the kind of myriad practices. That's kind of interesting, but so I don't know. I think there are all these kind of realms, that one participates in. So, and occasionally they'll intersect, but yeah, I don't have those kind of. I don't have any kind of visceral reaction to it.
So, does the collector figure in in the concept of your own practice at all?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't sold a lot. I admire the collector, I mean, because I have work here from friends, and I think there's something extremely, very special about living with a work over a long period of time. I mean, and if it keeps, and there are works here that I just enjoy looking at all the time. And I think the collector has a real advantage to explore and live with something for a long time. And I think over that period, they get rid of all kinds of things that are just so much a part of that first experience, the biography of the artist, the body connected to the work, the themes and subject and content is all, I think in some cases, I don't want to dismiss it, but that sometimes becomes a bit of a burden in front of the work. And that once you get past it, these things there, to me they're kind of ephemeral, and eventually you'll just have the thing, and that is, I think, a real advantage for the collector. So I really appreciate that, and I think and they can have a kind of intimacy with the work that maybe not even the critic or the art historian can have. That same, because they're just not with the work or living with the work in that way for such an extended period. I read this really great text by Elaine Scarry on beauty, and she talks a little bit about. She's writing about Matisse and how Matisse got kind of very interested in palm trees at one point. It was a whole series of palm trees, and that form of the palm tree, the way the light went through the leaves, was in all of his paintings, these kind of striped patterns. Anyways, she's just populated her whole space with prints of Matisse prints, and I found that kind of interesting.
Maintaining a career can be difficult, and let alone beginning a career. Any artist knows that there's a number of sacrifices that occur, or at least choices. In your own case, Nestor, have you found difficulties involved in constructing and maintaining a career?
It's not easy. I think the hardest part is when you've lost. When you're struggling to make work, I think it can be very difficult to find a way out of, and try all kinds of solutions. But that's always the difficult. When it all disappears when you are making things. It just all goes. is all in worth it. And so that always gives you a sense of, just remain a bit optimistic that it's going to happen. You just don't, it's not happening now. But I mean, that's definitely the most painful part. Sometimes I mean, I can't. The audience reaction. I know the audience is very important. I mean, it's kind of critical, that relationship, the engagement in the work, to affirm things, or especially to affirm what you're doing. And but when it's not reciprocated, that can be very difficult. But I don't know. It's not something you want to rely on, because I've made work where I think I'm very happy with this. It's kind of doing things that I like, but its reception was no, I wouldn't quite say the opposite, but was more mystifying for me. So it's hard to really gauge how the work will be received, and it can sting sometimes, but it's not enough to prevent you from giving it up, at least for me anyways. But yeah, I don't know, I mean, again, about teaching, the students, that's probably some kind of advice you want to give students. Well, and I don't know, I remember Leon Golub, a student asked Leon Golub, who was lecturing at Guelph, what advice he had for young artists. He said, well, if you can do anything else, do it. Because if I think they don't, it's hard. Yeah. But
Perseverance.
yeah, boy, but the pleasure you make from making things is amazing. I've been, and it doesn't even, and I realized something a while recently. I've come to all these kind of realizations recently because of mid-career, right? Looking back. So I discovered that I have the same experience when I'm evaluating an object. When I've made something, for example, I made some shells for my mother, and I went through the same kind of mental processes and methods, and I approached it, and I evaluated, and after I evaluated it in the same way I would evaluate an artwork, what I would and so this process of making things is I think is somewhat essential, and I apply it to everything. So I still think about those shells, and I like those shells, and I think, could this be incorporated into an exhibition at some time? And I think maybe, I think I'd be okay with that, of making some nice shells for an exhibition. Because it surprisingly provided the same kind of satisfaction that, making anything else provided. So something essential.
What about current technologies? Do you have use for them in particular? Technology has become such a factor in art practices, more so than perhaps was the case several decades ago. Do you find that the increase in the technological components available, and also perhaps even dominant in current practices in general, have any resonance for yourself?
Well, that was also something I kind of think is a common thread through, so I'm trying to find threads through the work. And that's something I've always been curious about. And I think it goes back to when I was very young. It was a moment that I kind of shared with my dad, which is when he brought a calculator, a Texas Instrument calculator. I think it was 8 or 9, and this thing was, it was a kind of, one of those moments that you can share, something you can't share a lot of moments with your parents, for various reasons, but this is one of these moments where we were both had the same level of kind of curiosity and engagement. We are at the same level in terms of our understanding of it in a way as well. You know, he was as mystified about it as an object as I was as a child. So that was a strange kind of moment. And so and I think that had a kind of important effect on me, because I've used technology and software a lot in everything I've done often. And I think one way I characterized it recently was that I'm interested in technology maybe at the end of its life, where there's a shift happening, and things where at the beginning, just before it's being adopted amongst the mainstream. Particularly amongst the mainstream, it's already, before it gets adopted into the mainstream, it's already been part of a kind of more specialized audience and practitioner. So right now I've just been using a lot of 3D scanning technology because I'm just kind of fascinated about it as a tool. But I think I've never, I think there's one aspect of technology that I've always kind of focused on, and it's been part of the practice, which is this feature of automation. There are different levels of automation within technology, hardware and software, and it's the level and degree of automation that's kind of interesting. And I know that it's largely a kind of what Turing called a simulation machine, digital media, and that's been kind of always been important for me, that this thing can produce certain things, and as a way of kind of reducing my not reducing, but allowing something kind of surprising to appear, because I know that if I try to do a drawing, there's always something. I know if I keep working at a drawing, I'll get better at it, but it's just so much more interesting to send it through something else to produce certain effects. And it gets rid of these habitual movements that always produce the same kind of result when I'm doing a drawing. It's hard, you have to have a lot of discipline to train yourself out of that, and the technology